Hi, this is David Daugherty, Worshipful Master of the Ohio Lodge of Research. I sit down with our Senior Warden, Chad Kopenski, our Junior Warden, Mike Miller, and Past Master Taylor Kleineick, as we discuss the topic of once you've begun your Masonic research, how do you bring it to a close? One of the last conversations we had, I had made the comment that one of my admirations of Brother Kopenski there is his ability to quickly bring ideas and research to fruition. And I think Mike was in my camp where we're really good at starting things and not so good at finishing things.
While looking up one question, I'll come across something else that will lead me to my next question of what, and this is why I never finish anything, is because one question will lead me to the next. Um, and then to answer the how do you finish research, kind of like we mentioned earlier, having a deadline. And maybe that's one thing I should do for myself is be better about setting a deadline. Um, and then that way I kind of push myself to actually complete whatever research I start.
Yeah, we are really good at asking questions. We're really good at trying to find those answers. But as you pointed out, Mike, every question you answer leads you to two or three more questions. And so this tree just keeps growing bigger and bigger and bigger. And I initially asked the question, how do we bring research to fruition? And I think the short answer is we never do, right? There is never an end. But the real question is, how do you bring it to a sharing point? Maybe that is the better way to say it. How do you reach it? How do you bring it to a point where it is a valuable to share to others? And as a mentor within the Royal Schofield Society, one of the things I have really preached to a lot of potential masters of the craft is you have a story to tell. And when you do research, you are going to generate far more information than you actually need to tell that story. So a challenge to research and a challenge to sharing your research is figuring out what the story you want figuring out the story that you want to tell and how you're going to tell it. So maybe that, I don't know that if there's a good question in there or not, but maybe the question is, how do you decide what the story is that you want to tell from the research that you do?
Without getting too weird, like this, I think there's sometimes where there is a particular story that you have to tell. Sometimes I think there's a particular story that, it kind of reveals itself to you. You know what I mean? I'm thinking about two different projects that I've done. One is, where I did talking about the working tools and what it meant to me. There, that was a story that I wanted to tell. So there was a beginning, middle, and end there. With my buddy Shearer, there's a story that keeps getting developed, and I get to a point where I'm like, okay, this is the story as I know it so far. And so my presentation usually is about, well, there's a couple of things. I tell Shearer's story, but then I also have to tell the story of how I discovered it and how I got involved with it. Two different purposes. But I agree with you that as you're doing this research, what you come up with is, what you know, what you think, and what you believe. And ultimately you have to kind of figure out, well, what am I gonna pare down? What is the narrative that I'm gonna be able to talk to people here or present to them? So
Yeah, I'm speaking for myself. One of the most convenient or luckiest pieces of research, Masonic research, that I have done is another paper that I presented to the Ohio Lodge of Research was on Hamilton Lodge number 4. Make sure you get the number right. 409, Hamilton Lodge number 409, which was a German-speaking lodge that existed for a number of years. And what was interesting to me is my home lodge, Washington number 17, was in possession of the minutes from number 409, since it had since folded many, many years prior. And as I was going through and cleaning out our safe and so forth, I ran across these minutes. And literally, and I'm not exaggerating, within 20 minutes, this entire story unfolded out in front of me. And it was like, oh, now I just have to figure out how much information do I need in order to tell the story. But the whole story was literally right there in front of me, just waiting to be told. And so that was, again, very convenient, very lucky. I don't think that's normal by any means, but I think you're right. It's how do you determine what story you want to tell?
Well, I think I've told most of you guys this. My obsession with Shearer is the presentation I gave, 3 weeks ago in Chicago, I couldn't give today because I've learned way too much since then. I had kind of some floodgates open, and it has absolutely blown the story I usually tell out of the water and tells something completely different. And in some ways, I don't say more interesting, but well, with this guy, when you answer one question, two more pop up. And as soon as you get one question sort of like ultimately settled, again, like three more pop up. Here's the two examples I'll give you. I couldn't prove that this guy was a Mason. He was an engraver from the 1800s. And when he died, it seemed like there was no ripple whatsoever. And quite by accident, I searched the Grand Lodge proceedings and I found one mention of him the year after he died. And so it actually did go noticed by somebody in an offhand comment by a grandmaster in his address. In his address, he mentioned that John Shearer was a member of a lodge in Massillon, Ohio. Massillon, Ohio is nowhere near Cincinnati, where he lived his entire life. In fact, it's the exact opposite corner of the state. But then I got to send an email to Darlene at Grand Lodge, and within 30 minutes, she sends me Shearer's Masonic record for Clinton 47 Lodge in Massillon, Ohio. I have a piece of research. I have a thing I can hold on to. But his Masonic record says he affiliated with that lodge in like 1860 something. From where?
Yeah.
So the story you end up telling is kind of where you are at that point. So
yeah, I think, Chad, I mean, not to lead you down another path that's going to create havoc for you. I think if this ever reaches an endpoint for you, you have two stories to tell that are going to be both of which are going to be very valuable to the Ohio Lodge of Research as well as to Masonry. One is the story of Shearer. That's the one you is obvious to you. The other is the story of how you researched Shearer. Because I think it is, seriously, I think it is a compelling story that it is not, that when you do research, it is not a linear path. It is not a straightforward path by any means. It is, it is a wicked web that we weave, and we have to figure out how to piece it all together. And so I think, that story, at least from the perspective of the Lodge of Research, is maybe even more compelling, because that will help a lot of other people figure out the mistakes they are making or not making in order to do research. And I use that phrase very intentionally, because a lot of times, by not allowing ourselves to make mistakes, we miss a lot of opportunities.
This is a couple of times now you said nice words about me, and I'm not sure how to take that.
It's all part of my evil plan. It'll come back.
I figured I'm dying and you haven't told me yet. This is your way of buttering.
Taylor, you were going to say something there. Taylor, you were going to say something productive there.
Yeah. I forgot. So I'll say something unproductive.
Say something unproductive then. Yeah.
I mean, I think that's I think the second story about your research and what you did, and how you found things out, and the timelines for that, the resources you used, the roadblocks you hit and how you overcame them, or how you found out other more useful information, is incredibly valuable to people who haven't done research before, right? And if we're looking at the Lodge of Research and growing our research base and our ability to produce quality papers, teaching people how to do research and getting them comfortable with some of these things is really important, right? Because somebody will publish a great 7-page paper that they've been researching for a decade. That if you don't know anything about research, might seem really intimidating. That this is a really well crafted paper. It takes a lot of work. Not everybody's comfortable with producing something like that. When you put a face to that, on the backside, that these are all the things that you went into it becomes less daunting. And there's only so many historians, only so many scientists and researchers we have in our fraternity, and that leaves a huge untapped potential group of people who could produce quality work, who definitely have the intelligence to make great stuff. They have great questions. They just don't have the technical knowledge, to go through the proceedings, or that they exist, or to go look through, newspapers or old, builders magazines, or call somebody at Grand Lodge. Sharing those stories and from our own lodge, I think, is critical for the success long term of what we're trying to accomplish.
Well, and to your point, I mean, that is really one of the big benefits of the Ohio Library Research, is to come to a meeting or to be able to have somebody to say, you know what, I have a question about this. And for somebody to, to say, yeah, it's a really good question. Have you looked here? Have you talked to this person? Do you know Nathan Trester at Yateman Lodge? Do you know, whomever? Like, have you looked at this source? This, and for me, a lot of the obstacles in my research have been overcome because I talked about where I was, and all of a sudden someone said, have you looked at this? I'm like, nope, didn't. Thank you. And led me down that path. So no, and I'll say nice things about the OLR again. And again, Taylor, Mike, David, I'd say that's all to you guys. This idea of, I don't want to say that the product isn't the most important thing, because the product is important, but it's the connections and the exploration that, I mean, is probably the most, I don't say most interesting, but at least most valuable at this point. So what counts, and where do you start, and what's okay? What's in the sandbox of Masonic research? Because I'll be honest, I always think I think nothing I've done technically is Masonic research necessarily. It's just kind of stuff, maybe the shearer stuff, but you know what I mean? Like, what would be accepted? I could see a new person thinking to themselves, what counts? Mm-hmm. What will be okay? So
people are going to look up different resources. What are some resources that you guys would think are credible resources, especially when you're talking about facts? Because a lot of Masonry is symbology, right? And so what it means from one person to another is going to be completely different. But the idea is to look at what it is intended to mean. So what are some resources you guys have used when completing papers? Because, the history papers and research, like you said, that's fairly cut and dry as far as looking at dates and time frames and things like that. But in other research that any of you guys have done, what have you guys used?
I think that's a loaded question. Because when you talk about symbology, there's two different, at least in my mind, there's two different perspectives. And one of them is historical and the other is not, because symbols by their very nature change. And symbols are open to the interpretation of any person that views them as a symbol. So I think within the Masonic realm, if you will, research on symbols falls under the two categories. One is historical. How has this symbol been viewed over time? And in that case, it falls under that same category you just listed of, it's historical. It's times, dates, et cetera, fairly straightforward. The other is an opinion. And it's not to say that it doesn't have a place, but you know, if I sit down and write my opinion of what a particular symbol means, no one can argue with me that it's right or wrong. It is my opinion. You could sit down and write the exact same, you know, same piece about the same symbol, have a completely different answer, and we can both be absolutely right because it is our opinion. I still think that falls under the category of research because it is expressing the viewpoint of various people. It's a very, very different type of research, however.
How I tend to kind of reject what you said earlier, that it's still too postmodern for me. Not everybody's opinion is valid, right? There are ways to have invalid opinions I believe. At the very least, there are bad opinions that are poorly justified, poorly formed, and are completely like incoherent in themselves. Right.
But does that mean it's invalid?
I would
Just
say
because
yeah.
you don't agree with it doesn't mean it's invalid.
Right. But then you do get into this whole, and this, it goes back to kind of some of the issues with postmodernism, some kind of completely detached from, you know, the real world, that, you know, there are no facts, there's just opinion, right? There's just your personal experience and what that means. And there's some truth to that, but again, it goes in my, at least in my, again, in my opinion, and kind of my philosophical beliefs, that, you know, the world is full of contradictions and opposing forces, and these things, you know, create paradoxes, and that's okay. That you can have, you know, paradoxical or contradictory viewpoints. That it can be true on the one hand that yes, everybody's opinion is true, and you can only really know your opinion. There also does seem to be reality. There does seem to be some connection. We might not have a great way of understanding that.
I believe that you have to be wrong before you can be right. Right. You have to question enough to actually understand what the issue is before you can come up with a good answer to it. And just because someone has, in your opinion or in somebody else's opinion, a bad interpretation of a symbol, it's part of their process of getting to a good interpretation of the symbol. And so, you know, being wrong isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's part of the process.
Having taught English 1,000 years ago, one of the things I noticed was that I loved interpreting things like poetry and, you know, like looking for symbolism. A lot of my students, all they really wanted is they'd kind of learned that if they were quiet long enough, somebody would tell them what this poem meant or what this thing meant. And so getting them to sort of recognize that it's okay to have a voice, it's okay to have an opinion. And I feel sometimes the same way about Masonry. You know, when you ask about symbols, so you're asking for a credible source, like you can read Mackey or Pike, or you can look at the web monitor, or, you know, Shearer and Morris's take on the web monitor. But ultimately, it's okay if you're like, these guys are just full of, these are knuckleheads. Like, and that's okay. It's absolutely okay if you disagree with, you know, Coach Nagy. And I just because honestly, I saw a picture of him on my Facebook. That's why that I'm saying that name. You have a voice, and it's okay to have one. So, and the second one is to your point, David, Keith Manbeck's masterpiece for Royal Schofield, in which he talked about the sprig of acacia. Half of it was historical. The other half was how it helped him, you know, with the death of his daughter. And both were valid, and both are powerful in their own rights. So there's certain things that you can control. There's certain things you can't. There's certain things you are going to know. There's certain things you never will. So you almost have to be okay with ambiguity, okay with failure, okay with not knowing, but being resolute and okay with what you can know and do know. But also recognizing that that may change based off of new information. And
so yeah, you guys kind of all answer my question in a different way. But so for the guy,
which is to say, Mike is now more confused than he ever was.
no. So I was just looking at if you guys like actually had some different credible resources that you guys use, and not necessarily symbology, just for the listener or the watcher who this is their first time, you know, clicking on this link and are thinking about writing a paper on something. We kind of went down they were good rabbit holes. But like, archives.gov, or what are some different things that you guys have used for resources?
I like Mackey's, Weight, and Coil. Their encyclopedias are good places to start, at least from there, and then Googling certain passages that you're interested in as like a whole section to find where they're kind of sourced at. Archive is a great place. Security.com is a really good resource too. Obviously, our website has a bunch of documents you can go through. I think Chad said Grand Lodge Proceedings is another good one.
Library of Congress, lsc.gov. It's amazing what you can find there. I think half the books that I gave to the Lodge of Research came from the Library of Congress. Half of the stuff I found from Shearer's in the Library of Congress. And what is very interesting is people do mention like Mackey and Pike, but there were some other people writing around the same time who have somewhat differing opinions. It's okay to look at, what's his name, Cross and his charts. It's okay to look at some of the commentaries on web, and you may not even know what you're reading, but even just sort of like, oh, this is their thought. Well, where did they get this? Why did, yeah, Library of Congress, Google Scholar. Honestly, so many libraries have great places. Cincinnati Library does. I've been going on a map because Shearer made maps, and you just find some of the weirdest auction house websites, and if all else fails, you just sort of ask somebody like, one of the weird things that I found was Cincinnati had business directories. So every year they published a directory of businesses that were active, including the person's business residence as well as their office residence. And those go all the way back to the 1830s. And that was probably the biggest breakthrough in my Shearer research, is because now, one, I could prove that he existed, and two, now I could start putting together a timeline. Like, who's he working with and where is he working? And that led to whole other questions. And so,
yeah, Mike, I think I would just answer the question very simply this way. Research is research. Masonic just happens to be the topic. If it's a good resource, regardless of where it comes from, then if you're doing Masonic research and it answers your question, then it is a good resource. I think we oftentimes get too caught up on having Masonic resources. And again, Masonry is just part of life. And, it is, to Chad's point about the business directories, or, wherever else you might find them, Library of Congress or whatever, that, if it is a good, reliable resource in the world, then it is a good, reliable resource for Masonic research. It's just the topic that you happen to be focusing on, is to me. Yeah.
Perfect. That's exactly where I was going with that. Yeah, because even, just some things that you wouldn't even think of, I had off of Google searches or Ancestry or Find a Grave, and then those always have other resources in them as well. So thank you guys.
Well, have we come to any conclusion whatsoever on how to bring research to conclusion?
No.
Okay. I think we've given important comments, but I don't know that we've answered the question necessarily. So
I keep going back to this idea of what do I know, what do I think, and what do I believe? And I think, to me, I think a presentation either has to be some kind of declaration of those things, right? In some kind of, ratio. Either this is exactly what I know for a fact. Boom, 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 boom. This is what I know, and this is what I think, in filling in the holes, right? So maybe it's the question of, is this right? Am I looking at this right? Or it's what do I believe? Based off of like nothing more than just my own intuition and thoughts, like, here's where this is. So I think if you get to a point where you have a pretty good ratio of, or whatever is appropriate, of what do I know, what do I think, and what do I believe, to put in front of people for them to actually give a comment on, I think that's when you end.
Thank you for joining us on this edition of OLR Connections. We hope you have enjoyed our thoughts and ideas as we have discussed topics relevant to the Ohio Lodge of Research and Masonic education in general.